Welcome to Mr.Terror Tales, where nightmares come to life and the unknown lurks around every corner. Tonight we have something special, a journey into the unknown, where the scariest thing isn't what's outside, but what waits for you inside someone else's home. 3 terrifying stories of people who ventured into unfamiliar houses, only to find themselves trapped in nightmares they could never escape. So turn off the lights, lock your doors, and prepare for a journey into horror. Because once you enter, there's no turning back. It was an ordinary Friday evening when Peter received the message. It came from Lucas, his childhood friend who he hadn't spoken to in years. The message was short, just 3 words. "Come over, I miss you." Feeling nostalgic, Peter, a 27-year-old man, decided to reconnect. Lucas had always been the quiet, mysterious type, but Peter was eager to catch up, so he drove to Lucas' house, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The house was tucked away behind tall, twisted trees, their branches seemingly reaching for the sky like skeletal hands. The windows were dark, and the place seemed to breathe with a life of its own. When Peter knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately, as though Lucas had been waiting for him. His friend stood there in the doorway wearing a smile that was wide and unnervingly bright. "Peter, I'm so glad you came." Lucas's voice was warm, yet there was something off about it, like it didn't quite match his eyes. Peter entered and immediately felt the air grow heavy. The house was dark, with only a few flickering lights, casting long shadows on the walls. The furniture was old, covered in white sheets that made the room look like a forgotten museum. But Lucas was thrilled to have him there, guiding him to the living room, where an old fireplace crackled faintly. "So, what's been going on with you?" Peter asked, trying to shake off the sense of unease. But Lucas simply stared at him, that smile never leaving his face. "Oh, not much. Just waiting for you," Lucas replied cryptically, his eyes glazed over as though he wasn't quite present. As the night dragged on, Peter couldn't help but notice that the house seemed to close in around him. The air grew thick and oppressive. There was no sound, no cars outside, no wind, no life, only the low hum of the fireplace. Every time Peter tried to leave, the front door seemed to grow farther away, as though the house itself was shifting and twisting, making escape impossible. The once warm smile on Lucas's face began to stretch unnaturally, the corners of his mouth pulling wider and wider. Peter's heart raced as his friend's face began to warp into something grotesque. "Please, Peter, stay with me forever," Lucas whispered, his voice suddenly deep and gravelly. The smile on his face had turned into a grotesque, unnatural grin. Peter tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His limbs went numb, as if the house itself had taken control of his body. Lucas's eyes turned black, his face dissolving into a haunting, featureless void as he reached for Peter. The last thing Peter saw was that wide, horrible grin, his own reflection now distorted in Lucas's eyes. Then everything went black. Emily's evening started like any other. A late-night drive home from a friend's party turned into a nightmare when her car sputtered to a halt in the middle of nowhere. The road was empty and her phone had no signal. Cold and desperate for help, Emily spotted a faint light in the distance. A small house, standing alone on the edge of the woods. Relieved, she approached the house and knocked on the door. It opened with a creak, revealing an elderly woman with thinning gray hair and milky, cataract-covered eyes. The woman's frail voice quivered as she welcomed Emily in. "Child, you look cold. Come inside. Warm yourself by the fire." Reluctantly, Emily stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, a chill ran through her, and the warmth of the fire didn't seem to reach her. The walls were adorned with strange dark portraits of people with haunting, lifeless eyes. The air smelled musty, like old paper and dust, and the floor creaked underfoot hate underfoot, with every step she took. "Would you like some tea?" the old woman asked, her frail hands shaking as she moved toward the kitchen. "I'll fetch it right away." But Emily, still unsettled, declined. She sat by the fire, her eyes wandering to the strange objects scattered around the room. Old books with pages falling out, cracked mirrors reflecting nothing, and odd trinkets that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. The silence in the room became deafening. Then the whispering began. At first it was so soft that Emily thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, echoing from the walls themselves. "Leave. Leave now. She's not alone." Her breath caught in her throat. Emily turned to the corner of the room where shadows seemed to shift. The air grew colder and the fire flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The elderly woman didn't answer. Instead, she stood motionless in the doorway to the kitchen, her face now completely blank, her body unnaturally still. The whispers turned to frantic voices, menacing, haunting, like dozens of spirits trapped in the house. "Leave," they hissed, each word wrapping around her throat like a cold, invisible hand. Desperate to escape, Emily rushed toward the door, but the moment her hand touched the knob, it disintegrated into dust. Panic set in as the walls seemed to grow taller, their edges darkening. A shadow, cold and menacing, slithered across the floor toward her. In a blur of motion, the old woman's face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage. Her eyes bulged wide, as her mouth opened impossibly wide, letting out a scream so chilling that Emily's heart stopped. But the scream didn't stop. The last thing Emily heard before the darkness consumed her was a horrifying cry, echoing through the empty house forever. Mark had always been drawn to the strange and abandoned. When he heard about the old mansion deep in the woods, he couldn't resist. Locals whispered that it was haunted, that a wealthy family once lived there, but they mysteriously vanished one night, leaving the house untouched. Mark didn't believe in ghost stories, and so, with a mix of curiosity and excitement, he ventured into the woods, following a narrow, overgrown path. The mansion loomed ahead, tall, dark, and imposing, with broken windows staring out like eyes watching his every move. As he crossed the threshold, the air grew cold and stale. The house was vast, with long, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceilings, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it was waiting for him. He explored room after room, his footsteps echoing through the emptiness. The silence was suffocating, the walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, and the floors creaked as though the house itself was groaning under his weight. But then, Mark noticed something unsettling. There were no mirrors, no reflective surfaces, not a single one. The house began to feel oppressive, as though it was closing in around him, and that's when he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, pacing behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The silence returned, but this time it felt alive, like something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Suddenly the temperature dropped, and Mark's breath turned to mist. He turned down a narrow hallway and saw it. The figure, tall, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and they seemed to follow him. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. No answer. The figure took a step toward him, its long, bony fingers reaching out. Mark tried to run, but the walls seemed to shift, turning into an endless maze. No matter which way he went, the figure was always just behind him, its presence growing closer, colder, and darker. Mark ran until his legs gave out, and the figure loomed over him. The last thing he heard was a voice, low and guttural, that seemed to come from the house itself. You're not the first to enter, and you won't be the last. And then, darkness. 3 houses, 3 terrifying encounters. And in each one, the real horror wasn't just the house itself, it was the dark, malevolent forces lurking within. Forces that watched, waited, and devoured those foolish enough to cross their threshold. What about you? Would you dare step inside the next house that calls you? Or will you heed the warning, never to go where the darkness lives? Comment below and let me know if you'd ever dare face these terrors. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell because more nightmares are waiting just around the corner. Good night, if you can sleep.